This is Eliot. But on giving the matter a little attention, we perceive that criticism, far from being a simple and orderly field of beneficent activity from which impostors can be readily ejected, is no better than a Sunday park of contending and contentious orators who have not even arrived at the articulation of their differences. Here, one would suppose, was a place for quiet cooperative labour. The critic, one would suppose, if he is to justify his existence, should endeavour to discipline his personal prejudices and cranks, tears to which we're all subject, and compose his differences with as many of his fellows as possible in the common pursuit of true judgment. When we find that quite the contrary prevails, we begin to suspect that the critic owes his livelihood to the violence and extremity of his opposition to other critics, or else to some trifling oddities of his own, with which he contrives to season the opinions which men already hold, and which, out of vanity or sloth, they prefer to maintain. We are tempted to expel the lot. No vulgar quarreling here, Eliot seems to protest, in this atmosphere so pointedly distinct from any violence and extremity. And yet, the entire passage is, while acute and witty, also at least abrasive, if not downright rude. In tone, it's nothing if not quarrelsome. Somehow, what claims to be an appeal for consensus is pitched emphatically against the conditions of consensual discussion. Avoiding arguments is, of course, another defining characteristic of the presently dominant consensus when it comes to things like the criticism of poetry. In this, there are two principal and complementary patterns of behaviour. The first is a commitment to praise, to positive value judgments wherever possible, and indeed even wherever challenging. In this respect, the ideal is to be as near as achievable an indiscriminately positive appreciator of poets. The second is to meet any difficult and non-consensual arguments with silence. Knowing whom not to engage with is just as important as knowing whom to praise. These rules apply most obviously to the critical discussion in and around what is called the poetry world, but they apply also, differently inflected, to the realm of academic discourse. Here too, quarrels need to be avoided like the plague, and in place of positive evaluation, there's a wholeheartedly passive receptiveness to those other academic writers judged to be the current key players in a discipline, who must be honoured by regular citation and whose areas of interest must be accepted without question as being important. Those areas are not all necessarily literary by any means, though the academic currency of particular authors does fluctuate and needs to be watched attentively. Many are broadly historical, cultural and political. In relation to these, no young academic can afford to question current market valuations, nor she or he in the slightest to be blamed for their needful caution. Yet the effect over time is a baleful one, for the possibility of proper critical discussion within the forum of specifically academic and professional discourse becomes more and more constrained to the point at which it disappears altogether. Concentration and constraint have been going on for a long time, but where we now have a relationship of mutual esteem between poets and their critics, or more accurately in a lot of cases between poet critics and critic poets, who frequently coexist in the same person, there was once a wariness and a measure of real distrust. In 1963, Elizabeth Bishop could write to Robert Lowell about a recently published critical symposium on his work, Skunk Hour, registering the unwelcome effects of the then dominant models of critical attention to poetry, which were on display. "Oh dear," she wrote, "I do loathe explanations, etc. And it seems to me a symposium should do more or less, something quite different at any rate. All this explaining should mostly go without saying, I think. And yet, that is what people ask for. To hell with explainers. That's really why I don't want to teach." The fact that Bishop did end up having to teach shouldn't lessen the force of this. Indeed, it may even make that force more interesting for us. And her own critical powers are revealed in the same letter, with a few lines on Skunk Hour that easily surpass anything written about that poem before or since. It has so much life. It has so much more life to it than you'd ever guess from those essays, she writes, and so much wonderful, distant, slightly hesitant, but nevertheless sure as a hymn kind of northern music to it. Yet amid all the noise of the tenured explainers, the professors and the poet critics and the critic poets at work here, there and everywhere in the booming university system that makes good money from the humanities, Bishop knows exactly what is never being mentioned. She goes on. "The trouble is, excuse my cliches, as people grow older, non-artists that is, they do have to steel themselves so much, forget so much, and try to pretend that everything's all right so much. They're afraid, probably rightly, that poetry, any art, if they take it hard, might upset them. So they pretend they like it, while at the same time they resist it absolutely." 52 years later, this is one of those truths which remains unsayable. To air it now, whenever, say, yet another anthology makes its marketing pitch on the promise that poetry can change your life for the better, would be understood simply as quarrelsome, the work of an elitist, a spoiler, or, at best and condescendingly, a useful gadfly. Yet it's a great poet, and writing to another great poet. I myself think that it's absolutely true. There's a venerable quarrel, as we know, between poetry and intellectual abstraction. Ironically, the quarrel itself can fuel more poetry. One instance from 1,000 is in John Keats's Lamia. "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, the nomad mine, unweave a rainbow, as it erstwhile made the tender personed Lamia melt into a shade." Now, this is much less grown up, you might say, than Bishop, but the fact that added intellectual maturity would ruin it is really just one way of noticing the power and authenticity of its perspective. And the narrative of Lamia as a whole, we should remember, is rather more circumspect on these very issues. Nevertheless, cold philosophy is always ready with its wing clippers whenever academic criticism takes stock of poetry. And just because the philosophical assumptions of Keats's time have changed, we should not assume that the imperatives of institutionalized knowledge have put those clippers away. On the one hand, poetry of powerful interests, I beg your pardon, plenty of powerful interests, know what it is the business of poetry to be doing. On the other, reciprocally, there's no shortage of poets who look to those interests in order to learn what it is that they should do. Luckily for all concerned, there's no quarrel about this, for all sides are happy to be in underlying agreement. Yet the contemporary academy is intellectually constrained and directed to a degree that far outdoes anything prevailing in Bishop's time. It's important to say that there are wholly beneficial consequences of academic professionalism, too many to list here. Over the last 50 years, too, the Academy has been the breeding ground and practical enabler of some permanently valuable scholarly and critical contributions to the way we know and think about poetry. Its authority also has been used for good purposes. Nothing is objectionable about a system of intellectual discipline, which results, for example, in Shakespeare deniers finding themselves shut out by respectable publishers, or the blatantly perverse being driven to revalue writers who were never much valued in the first place, only to a few friends in the pub. Exclusion can be a good thing. Even so, there's been for some time a state of affairs in which whole swathes of subject attention and critical method are either devalued or declared inappropriate to present needs and are thus rendered off limits. A profession needs a governing narrative to explain itself to the world, and for literary academe that narrative has become one of progress, as though critical appreciation were on a par with truly progressive kinds of knowledge, such as the sciences. But who decides what progress looks like? And how can something as definite as progress be a quarrel? Professional power exercises itself by being thoroughly conflict averse. This requires consensus, and it's of the essence that consensus need not speak its name. Simply, consensus is what everyone knows without having to say so. In the contemporary academy, everyone, that is to say everyone in positions of substantial institutional disciplinary power, knows that literary criticism can only exist under sufferance of various kinds. It should be able and willing to historicise itself, relate itself to another approved field of attention, political, cultural, gender-based, psychological, philosophical, even medical, and generally prove amenable to translation into terms other than its own. Everyone knows, too, that the study of authors has progressed beyond what was once thought of as a canon, that what was formerly known and valued must now be interrogated and searched for ideological goods which mostly it never possessed, and that busy stock-taking of all possible academic activity, however minor, on a given topic in the last few years counts for more than serious consideration and elucidation of work from 10, 20, or even 100 years ago. The most polished and professional work in academic criticism is generally assumed to be that which is most up to date, most closely attuned to the unspoken consensus of the day, and most nearly, in intellectual terms, empty. Everybody who is anybody in academia knows all this, but they do not say it, because there's never any need for them to do so. Saying it, doubtless, would simply appall them, and would be treated as a lapse in taste, when in truth it's more in the nature of a breach in protocol. In some ways, as far as literary criticism's interests are concerned, this does not greatly matter. Art may not need to bother its head with the opinions of professors in the humanities, and there are an awful lot of these in the world, for very much longer. Already almost nobody is listening, and before long few will be willing to make the investment, as students or as apprentices in the increasingly ramshackle system itself, in finding out. The currently cried up crisis in the humanities is also, to co-opt another phrase